So, Anthony, I know that you've just come back from a Counselling and Psychotherapy Research conference in Copenhagen. Was there anything particularly interesting about the conference that you want to talk about?
Yes, there were some very interesting things, and one in particular actually that is particularly relevant to CPCAB and our training centres. It was the Society for Psychotherapy Research, which is founded and based in America, but is very international now. And this conference had about 800 delegates from all over the world. It was based in Copenhagen. Next year it's back in the States. It tends to be in the States one year and then somewhere else the next year and then back in the States. And I went to a previous conference in Europe 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I've also been to, because it's an international society, there are various chapters. I've been to the UK chapter conference, and I've also been to the European chapter conference. So it's one of the organisations that I found most valuable in terms of being a member and going to their conferences. Mm-hmm. So very large, about 800 delegates, lots and lots of papers being presented.
So was this over a weekend or...?
Well, there was a pre-conference workshop on the Wednesday and it went through to the Saturday evening. Right. So 4 days in effect. And in fact, it was one of the pre-conference workshops which was the most interesting, I think, especially for our training centres. And this was on trainee development. And in essence, the Society for Psychotherapy Research is starting a pilot researching trainee development. It's an international project. I think about 50, by the end of the conference, about 50 training centres had signed up to take part in this pilot. Mm-hmm. And what they'll be doing is continuous kind of piece of research across all of these centres where they'll be looking at the centre, but mostly they'll be looking at, or the trainee will be completing a set of questionnaires at different points in their training. So they start with a questionnaire and then they complete different ones in their, after say 6 months, and then the next 6 months and whatever. Mm. And also, as part of this, there are other questionnaires to do with cases. So trainees will be able to complete these questionnaires in relation to particular clients they're working with. And what they're going to be doing is looking at how, based on what will be probably hundreds, if not thousands of trainees, how they are developing through the training. It's a pilot, so they hope that after the pilot they'll roll it out into a full-blown research project. And it's really based upon another project that they've been managing, which they initiated in 1989, which is quite a long time ago, on counsellors and therapists development. So that one, which has, I think it's nearly 12,000 practitioners, they are doing the same kind of thing, filling in these various questionnaires every 6 months or so, and they've been studying the development of counsellors through their practice from novice to very experienced, and after many years of practice.
So just going back to the project about the trainees and the trainee
Yes.
development for a moment, what are they aiming to find out? Are they aiming to find out ways of improving the training, to find out the gaps or the blockages, the points where the trainee is not developing that well? Is that the aim of it?
I think that would be one of the outcomes. I think what I would say is that they want to develop a huge, what's called a data set. In other words, lots of research information which then can be interrogated. This is a collaborative project, so that everybody involved in it has access to this data and can do, they can, so you'll have different researchers asking different questions of this information and looking for answers, those kinds of conclusions, such as, how might training, or what works well in training, for example. That's the kind of thing that they might ask, and they'll have the information, or they'll have some information which relates to that question. And I think that's the same with the practitioner project. They have a huge data set which researchers are continuing to ask questions about. And some very interesting work has come out of that original work on the practitioners, the one that started in 1989. And there's a very, very good book called The Developing Practitioner by Helge Ronestad and Skovholt. That's well worth taking a look at. And my hope is that some very interesting conclusions will come from this, yes. So that was at the pre-conference workshop, but it also, they had a special interest meeting later in the conference, and they also had a presentation on this pilot. And I think that we will look at least providing information to our centres on how they might participate, if not in the pilot, in the full-blown project.
When you say our centres, you mean centres that are registered with CPCAB?
Yes, yeah. Training centres that are registered to offer our qualifications. So quite the findings aren't there yet, but in the future it's going to be very exciting, I think, the kinds of questions and findings that will come out of this pretty enormous international project, really, on the development of trainees. And
they're going to keep with it year after year?
Yes.
In the same way they have done with therapists? Right?
Yes. The idea is that it will be fairly open-ended in terms of how long the project runs. As I said, it's a collaborative project. It's also one that isn't funded. The original one wasn't funded either. It's voluntary. People participate as volunteers, including the researchers. But then obviously, for the researchers, they get access to a lot of data that they can be very helpful for them in terms of asking interesting questions and finding interesting answers. So that was quite exciting, really. As I say, particularly because we're in the CPCAB's in the area of training. We're in that educational area. And hopefully there's going to be some useful findings which we can use to inform our qualifications and also to support our centres in becoming more effective as training organisations. So that was really good, and I also went to some other very interesting. Went to quite a few presentations, and it's as I say, I've been to other conferences over the years, not just with the Society for Psychotherapy Research, but also the BACP has a very good conference every year, research conference. Been to that quite a few times, and Counselling Psychology, and there's another organisation called the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, which is a very big mouthful, but they have some pretty good conferences too. Because CPCAB is very interested in generic ways of understanding counselling and psychotherapy, and that's the focus of that organisation, the integrative or generic nature of counselling and psychotherapy. And I think this time at the Copenhagen conference, I really got a sense of where the field is moving as well. And it's moving in a very interesting way. I think originally it was all about treatments. There's still an interest in treatments, but now the most interesting areas seem to be in the areas of what's called therapist effects and also the client.
Therapist effects? What does that mean?
Well, it's really the researchers have identified 4 categories of factors, or 4 areas of factors that contribute to therapeutic change. And those are the client, the therapist, the relationship, the therapeutic relationship, and the treatment or the use of techniques. Now, therapist effects are essentially therapist factors. And it's how the therapist... Well, the most interesting work that's come out, or findings that have come out in recent years, and it's been repeated, is that there is a huge difference between therapists or counsellors. In other words, some are not very good at facilitating change, and some are very good at facilitating change. And then there's the most are in the middle. Okay?
This is client change.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what you'll see when they have these graphs, and they go like this. So you have the most in the middle. This is when they're studying, say, 1,000 clients working with, say, 50 or 100 therapists or counsellors. So you'll have some counsellors that don't achieve very much change with their clients. And also, one of the most... where they've begun to focus is on dropouts. Okay, so these tend to have a lot of dropouts as well. Whereas the ones who facilitate a lot of change, they tend to have not many dropouts comparatively.
By dropouts, you mean clients who stop attending sessions, just disappear?
Yes, and particularly, and I was at the BACP conference, and I attended a presentation there that was looking at the provision in primary care through IAPT and also counselling, and they were comparing the two actually, CBT and counselling. Anyway, interestingly, there's not much difference. As much other research is saying the same thing, there's really not that much difference between the different treatments, if any. But particularly in public services, the main issue now seems to be dropout. In other words, those who stick it out, the clients that stick it out, are the ones that tend to do well. Obviously, if they drop out, they tend not to achieve quite so much in terms of therapeutic change. And in the public sector services, there are a lot of dropouts. So that's become a big question. What is it about the counsellors or psychotherapists who manage to keep clients in, and what is it about those that have lots of dropouts? So this is like a huge question really for the services, because obviously they want people to not drop out and to continue and to have achieve therapeutic change, to have got something out of it really. Anyway, there's lots of work now on this difference between those that are really quite ineffective and those who are really quite effective. And they have come out, a few years ago, they came out with a term which a lot of people don't like, neither do I really, it's called super shrink, for the ones that are really quite effective.
But at the conference, were they presenting research results that identified the factors that made the clients that kept clients that didn't have lots of dropouts? Did the conference identify what they thought were the reasons why? Or was it just posing the question?
I think they're just at the stage of posing the question. I mean, I could come up with my answers to that, but I don't think the researchers have yet. They've only reached this point where they're realising that these differences are, very, very clear in the data, and they're now beginning to ask these questions. Yes, but I think they're quite difficult questions to answer. That's one of the problems. my answer would be it's things to do with how you engage somebody in the process. That's for me an important key element of if somebody's sitting there, I need to monitor how they are, and if I sense that they are finding it difficult or withdrawing from it's really to do in a sense with the relationship, and it's having a sense as a counsellor of how this person is in this relationship and having that sense all the time. So clients might find it difficult at first, and it's really a signal. It's being sensitive. It's almost when somebody withdraws from you emotionally or whatever, you can tell. If you're not thinking too much about lots of other things and you're focusing on the client, you can have some sense of when they're withdrawing. And it's being mindful, to use a term that's used a lot in counselling and in the research now. It's being mindful of that and responding to it. So if I feel someone's withdrawing, I notice it and I respond. I stop what I'm doing, if you like, and focus on that. And they may, give them space perhaps to express something. For example, they may. I think a good example is I once had the experience where a client, at the end of one session, I thought we were laughing about something together. At the beginning of the next session, I really felt this person had withdrawn from the relationship. We'd agreed to do certain things, but I set those aside to look at what was going on for this person. I gave him the space to express things. And what came out was that he felt I was laughing at him. Not that we were laughing, I felt we were laughing together. He felt I was laughing at him. And so, if I hadn't set aside what we'd agreed to do, if I had simply carried on with that, not taken account of the way that this person had disengaged from, I felt they'd disengaged, then he may well have dropped out. So there's the kind of thing. It's about being aware of where this person is in the relationship. The problem is that that's very difficult for researchers to kind of... the researchers are getting more sophisticated in what they can do, and they're starting to ask more sophisticated questions, but it's quite hard to research that kind of subtleties in the relationship and the way that the counsellor's responding to how someone is. You wouldn't really see it on a camera, for example, or maybe you would, but you would only see it as somebody watching and engaged in the emotions. You wouldn't necessarily see something very specific. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. I mean, does it have anything to do with the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research?
That's something to think about, but I would say yes. I mean, quantitative research, which is about very much about measurement, probably would find it more difficult. Whereas qualitative research, particularly if you're using observers who make judgments about the complexity of the relationship, rather than simply measuring outcomes.
Because you're talking about something you've described, something you've said is hard to measure.
Yes.
In this.
Yes, it is hard to measure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So qualitative research would have a better chance of trying to capture what I'm talking about and find out more really, and look at comparisons between different therapists. And I suppose that the other thing I would say about this conference is that perhaps what I came away with, I certainly came away with that project on training as a kind of exciting future. Looking forward to their findings, looking forward to what they're going to do with it. I think, as I say, I've been to quite a lot of research conferences over the years now, and I'm getting to a stage where I'm, how can I put this? I think what I realised was that there are some researchers who, for me, really do understand what I understand counselling and psychotherapy to be about and what I understand the therapeutic process to be about. And for me, these researchers are asking and answering some interesting questions and doing some interesting research, right? Whereas there are other researchers at the other end, if you like, who perhaps, because they're focusing in on the public sector, which tends to be quite short term, we're talking 1 to 6 sessions, their understanding of what a therapeutic process, the potential of a therapeutic process, the potential of a therapeutic relationship is, their understanding is very limited in comparison. I mean, for me, what you can achieve in 1 to 6 sessions, you can achieve good things, but you can achieve a lot more in a more in-depth, longer-term or medium-term relationship. And I was quite surprised, really. There's a very good department that's in Oslo, the University of Oslo, and they're doing some really interesting work, all based around the professor, really, Professor Helge Ronnestad, who I've mentioned already. He's written a book, The Developing Practitioner. They're doing some really interesting work, and I think the average number of sessions on their clients is 28, which is substantially bigger than 1 to 6. The 1 to 6 is, I think, that they're aiming for 6, but the 1 is a lot of people dropping out, so they only have 1 session. Anyway, what I was surprised about really was that they have what's called a discussant at the end of the presentations. Somebody comes in from outside, if you like, and discusses them. And this was like a really famous American researcher. And I was surprised at, firstly, it was clear that almost everything he was concerned about was the 1 to 6 sessions. And secondly, he found one of the presentations very challenging. And it was this. One of the presentations was basically about how in the therapeutic process, and we're talking the 28 session average, so the more medium term, how clients often get worse, as in they start to feel worse, before a sudden and quite dramatic feeling a lot better towards the end. And this tends to happen towards the end. So it's like kind of, if you saw a graph of the therapeutic process, it would be like going up, as in people feeling better, and then they suddenly go right down, and then they go right back up. And they tend to sustain that change after the end of the relationship. Okay. Now this American researcher found it very challenging, that notion, because he said what he's looking for is a continuous process of getting better. And that's all they're interested in. Right? So this notion that you might get worse before you get better was new to him, or maybe it wasn't new, but it was very challenging. Now, for me, not all relationships are going to be like that, but certainly many relationships, therapeutic relationships, are going to have a difficult phase. And that's simply because if somebody's going to look at their pain, it's going to be painful. But it kind of takes time to get to the point where they feel enough trust in the relationship and in themselves to take a look at that pain, and then they do feel bad for a little while. Worse. But then, having done that, there is a sense of liberation from that pain, and they feel a lot better.
So does this suggest that the short-term counselling, the 1 to 6 sessions, is fairly superficial by comparison? That it's not really getting the client, there's not sufficient time to allow for the client to actually focus on stuff that's painful, that they don't want to focus on. They can avoid really getting to grips with difficult stuff.
What I would say is that for some clients, short-term work can be very valuable, and they don't need, longer, medium-term or long-term work. However, I do feel that choice should be driven by, the counsellor and the client making that decision, rather than perhaps what happens most of the time, which is it's driven by health policy and, in particular, money. It costs more for medium to long-term work. Short-term work is a lot less expensive. So, so long as that's not the driving force behind short-term work, then I would say it's good to have short-term work as part of provision. But for some people, certainly a more medium to long-term relationship is needed for them to kind of achieve any meaningful therapeutic change. And certainly for some people, the longer term, as in more than 28, a lot more than 28 sessions, is perhaps needed, because they have fairly in-depth, complex mental health problems, and that's what when you're talking about the private or the public sector. I mean, the public sector is always going to be asking the money, is it worth it? Asking the question, not asking the money. Asking the question is it worth the money?
So, but would you say, therefore, that just purely in terms of money and economics, for those clients that do need more than the standard 1 to 6 sessions that's often made available to them, that it's in the long term it's actually more cost effective, it saves society, the taxpayer, the government money by having the longer treatments, medium term or longer term treatments available, because it actually enables the clients concerned to improve in a real sense, and that maybe for some of the clients who are just getting the short sessions, who don't really, it's not what they need, they don't benefit from that, it's actually a bit of a waste of money providing it for them. So would you say that it's more cost effective to actually provide these medium and long term treatments?
What I would say is that if you want to use counselling and psychotherapy effectively, then you need all three. And that needs to be the decision on that needs to be a clinical decision, not a cost decision. So if you decide that actually it is worthwhile to have counselling and psychotherapy and for it to help people to recover from common mental health problems, for example, because not only are they going to cost money regularly on and off if they don't, but also they can work more, they can live more fuller lives and work more effectively, then yes, I think you need short, medium and long-term work. And I would also add in there as well that there are some clients who, from my perspective, without question need a kind of continuous, indefinite almost, not necessarily weekly, perhaps just monthly. And in terms of cost, I think all you need to do is talk to a whole group of GPs about these clients, because they're the ones who regularly go to the GP for various medically unexplained symptoms, but are really going along because the GP is somebody that they feel a bit safer with and who they need to touch base with in order to kind of cope with their lives a little bit better. And having somebody who's actually therapeutically trained in the GP practice who could be working with these people rather than simply, seeing the doctor every week, perhaps every few weeks, as they do, then that's a better use of health resources. Now, people who are keen on short-term work, they often criticise people who are more keen on medium to long-term work, which I suppose I would put myself in the medium to long-term category, although I recognise the value of short-term work. They criticise the counsellors and psychotherapists by saying, oh yes, it's a really nice that you've got, if you're in private practice, or even if you're in the public sector, that you've got someone coming along and they're regularly paying you money or whatever, But I would say that actually there's a swings and roundabouts on that. It's maybe some counsellors and psychotherapists do get used to that kind of thing, it's true. But equally well, when I moved from shorter term work to more medium to long term work, I found that quite challenging, because you're moving from working with somebody who you're only going to see for a little while to somebody who does actually become somewhat dependent on you, at least for a period of time. And that's quite challenging to have a number of clients, say, who are dependent on you and for whom you have to start thinking about, if I go on holiday, I'm going to have to prepare all these clients for the fact that I'm going to go on holiday, and I'm going to have to cope with them afterwards when I come back, because these breaks have an effect. They can get clients who are in a deep therapeutic relationship with you, who are dependent on you, who trust you. You've gone, you've started a process that you can't just you can't just abandon them halfway through. Sometimes you have to if you have a heart attack or something like that. But as a professional, ethical, moral person, you don't abandon them unless you absolutely have to. So it's not, for me, it was quite challenging. I didn't particularly want to take that on, but I also recognised that if I didn't, I knew that these people, I wasn't going to be able to offer them a fulsome recovery, if you like. The shorter term work wasn't enough.
Well, thank you, Anthony, for telling us a little bit about this research conference in Copenhagen and some of the issues that arose there and some of the types of research that are being looked at and currently underway. That was all. Yeah,
I think the one thing I just mentioned, which is very much at the edge of the conference as well, is that I noticed there's a growing interest in the client factors. And in some sense, there's a growing awareness that just like there might be, in inverted commas, super shrinks, there are also, again, in inverted commas, kind of super clients. And that's really, it's not just about the therapist, it's not just about the relationship, it's also about the client. And it's also about treatment techniques. But they're now just beginning to get interested in what makes for an active client, if you like. Because perhaps it's not just the therapist who has an effect on dropout, but it's the type of client, if you like, that's coming in. Some who really engage, kind of, for whatever reason, they really engage and they're really active in the therapeutic process, tend to do well, whereas those who don't really engage and don't really, who are not that active, are more passive, they're the ones that aren't doing so well. So yes, an interesting conference. I look forward to the next one.
Good. Well, thank you, Anthony.
Okay.